What happens when the worlds of obscene wealth and desperate survival collide on a polished marble floor? This isn't a fairy tale. This is the story of a dare, a humiliation designed for sport by a man who owned the world. He was Damien Blackwood, a billionaire whose name was a weapon in boardrooms. And she was Isabella Rossi, a waitress he saw as nothing more than part of the furniture. He offered her $10,000 to dance in the middle of his power dinner, expecting a clumsy, pitiful show. What he got instead was a firestorm that shattered the silence, a performance that exposed a secret talent so profound it would threaten to bring his entire, carefully constructed world crashing down. Stay tuned, because you are about to witness how a single dance can become an act of war. The air in Aurea wasn't just air. It was a curated atmosphere, filtered and chilled to the precise temperature of unobtainable luxury. It smelled of money, a heady blend of vintage Bordeaux truffle oil, and the subtle expensive perfume that clung to the silk and cashmere of its clientele. For Isabella Rossi, it mostly smelled of pressure. The pressure of balancing 3 plates of seared scallops on one arm, the pressure of a smile that felt stapled to her face, and the crushing, ever-present pressure of the medical bills tucked away in her worn-out wallet. For 2 years, Isabella had moved through this gilded cage like a ghost. She was efficient, quiet, and invisible, 3 qualities her manager, a perpetually stressed man named Mr. Henderson, prized above all others. She learned the patron's preferences. Mrs. Vanderbilt took her water with no ice, and a single slice of lemon. Mr. Chen preferred his steak, charred on the outside and bleeding on the inside, and the tech moguls from Silicon Valley always wanted the most expensive Japanese whiskey, which they would then ignore for most of the night. She was good at her job because she understood the fundamental rule of Aurea. She was not a person, she was an extension of the service. Her thoughts, her dreams, her aching feet, none of it existed within these walls. Here she was, only a pair of hands, refilling a glass, clearing a plate and murmuring, "Enjoy your evening." Tonight the pressure was different. It was concentrated at the restaurant's prime table, a circular booth upholstered in plush velvet that offered a panoramic view of the San Francisco skyline. Table 12. Damien Blackwood's table. Even people who didn't follow the markets knew his name. Blackwood Capital was a behemoth, a leviathan, that swallowed startups and spat out empires. Damien Blackwood himself was the subject of endless fascination and fear. He was notoriously private, rarely photographed, and legendarily ruthless. They said he could gut a company with a single phone call, that he saw human beings as assets or liabilities on a spreadsheet. Seeing him in person was like watching a panther in a zoo. The predatory grace was undeniable even in repose. He was flanked by 3 other men, all cut from the same expensive cloth, their bespoke suits a kind of uniform. Their conversation was a low murmur of market caps and acquisitions, a language as foreign to Isabella as ancient Greek. She approached the table with the practiced invisibility she had perfected. "Good evening, gentlemen. May I get you started with something from the bar?" She asked, her voice a soft, neutral hum. Damien Blackwood didn't look at her. His eyes, a shade of grey, so pale they were almost silver, were fixed on the man opposite him. He made a dismissive gesture with his hand, a flick of the wrist that said, "Go away," without the courtesy of words. One of the other men, a slightly older man with a florid face, answered for him. 4 glasses of the Pappy Van Winkle, the 23-year. Isabella nodded, her face impassive, though her stomach tightened. That was over $2,000 of whiskey, right there. Enough to cover her father's physical therapy for 3 months. She turned to leave, but Blackwood's voice, cold and sharp as breaking glass, stopped her. "Not you," he said. He still wasn't looking at her, but the command was absolute. "Get Arthur. He knows what I drink." Arthur was the sommelier, a man with a PhD in oenology, who fawned over Blackwood like a courtier before a king. It was a calculated insult, a reminder of her place. She was not qualified to carry his whiskey. She was just the help. "Of course, sir," Isabella said, her voice betraying nothing. She retreated, her back straight, her steps measured. The humiliation was a familiar heat, a dull flush on her cheeks that she had long since learned to ignore. She found Arthur relayed the order and moved on to her other tables, the rhythm of her work, a welcome distraction. For the next hour she orbited table 12, clearing bread plates, refilling water glasses, a silent cog in the machine. She could feel Damien Blackwood's presence, like a drop in barometric pressure. He never acknowledged her, never made eye contact. It was as if she were a self-operating machine, a pair of disembodied hands. And in that, she found a strange sort of safety. If he didn't see her, he couldn't hurt her. The main courses had been served, and a temporary lull fell over the dining room. From the restaurant's hidden speakers, a soft classical piece began to play, a Chopin nocturne. It was one her mother used to play on their old out-of-tune piano before she passed away. The melody was a ghost, a bittersweet ache in Isabella's chest. Without thinking, as she stood by her station, folding napkins, her body swayed ever so slightly, a microscopic movement, a dancer's muscle memory stirring from a long slumber. Her fingers, hidden beneath a napkin, traced a phantom arpeggio in the air. It was a tiny, private moment unseen by anyone, or so she thought. "What is that you're doing?" The voice was Damien Blackwood's. This time he was looking directly at her. His gaze was not just observant, it was dissecting. He had seen her. For the first time all night she was no longer invisible, and it felt terrifying, like being caught naked under a spotlight. "Sir," she stammered, her hands freezing. "With your hands and your shoulders," he said, his voice flat, devoid of curiosity, full of accusation. "You were moving." The other men at the table fell silent, turning to watch the exchange. It was sport. The lion had finally noticed the mouse. I apologize, sir. I was just listening to the music," Isabella said, her cheeks burning. Blackwood let out a short, humorless laugh. It was a dry, ugly sound. "Listening to the music? And you fancy yourself a dancer, do you? A little ballerina in a waitress uniform?" The condescension in his tone was a physical blow. He was mocking her, peeling back her professional veneer to poke at the raw, vulnerable person underneath. "No, sir," she said, her voice tight. Pride, a stubborn, foolish thing, straightened her spine. "Don't lie," he said, leaning forward slightly. His silver eyes narrowed. "I can see it. You have the posture. Straight back, neck held high. You think you're better than this, don't you?" She didn't answer. Saying yes would be insubordination. Saying no would be a lie. Her silence seemed to amuse him even more. "I'm bored," Blackwood announced to the table, though his eyes never left Isabella. "This deal is a foregone conclusion. We need some entertainment." He looked her up and down, a slow, appraising glance that felt like being audited. "I bet you can't dance." "Damien, leave the girl alone," the older man said, shifting uncomfortably. "Nonsense, Robert. I'm making her an offer." Blackwood said, his voice silky smooth now, which was somehow more menacing. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a checkbook and a fountain pen, made of what looked like polished obsidian. "I'll make it interesting. $10,000. The number hung in the air, shimmering and obscene. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. $10,000. It was a lifeline. It was her father's next round of treatments. It was a temporary reprieve from the suffocating weight of debt. "What?" she whispered. $10,000, he repeated, scribbling on the check. For you to dance, right here, right now, one song, entertain us. He tore the check from the book with a sharp, satisfying rip and placed it on the edge of the table. What do you say, little ballerina? Is your pride worth more than $10,000? The room had gone quiet. The surrounding tables, sensing the drama, had lowered their voices. Everyone was watching. It was a public crucifixion. He wasn't just daring her to dance, he was daring her to put a price on her own dignity. He expected her to refuse to scurry away in shame, or worse, to accept and make a fool of herself, a clumsy, pathetic spectacle for his amusement. He thought he had her trapped, that he had won before the game had even begun. Isabella looked at the check. Then she looked at his face, at the smug, arrogant certainty in his silver eyes. And in that moment, something inside her, something she thought had died long ago on a cold, unforgiving stage, broke free. The silence in Aurea stretched thin, a fragile membrane about to burst. Every eye in the restaurant was now fixed on the tableau at table 12, the billionaire with his imperious smirk, the check lying on the white linen like a gauntlet, and the waitress frozen in the harsh glare of his challenge. Isabella could feel the weight of their collective gaze, a physical pressure on her skin. They were expecting a spectacle of humiliation. They were waiting for the mouse to squeak. Her mind was a maelstrom. $10,000. The number pulsed behind her eyes, a beacon of hope in a sea of despair. It wasn't just money. It was time. Time for her father, a man who had worked his fingers to the bone as a carpenter until a degenerative nerve disease had stolen the strength from his hands. The disease was winning, and the cost of fighting back was astronomical. This check wasn't a luxury. It was medicine therapy, a few more months of holding the line against the inevitable. But her soul recoiled. He wanted to buy a piece of her, the most sacred broken piece. Her dance was not a performance. It was a eulogy. It was the ghost of the girl she used to be, the girl who lived and breathed for the soaring leap, the perfect pirouette, the breathtaking hush of an audience before the final chord. She had buried that girl under layers of scar tissue, both physical and emotional, after the fall that had shattered her ankle and her dreams in one catastrophic instant. To dance now here, in this uniform for this man's cruel amusement, it felt like digging up a grave and selling the bones. She looked at Damian Blackwood. He was watching her, his expression a mixture of boredom and predatory curiosity. He saw a simple equation, her desperation versus her pride. For him, it was a game of numbers, and he was certain desperation would always have the higher value. He didn't see the fire banked deep within her, the embers of a prodigy who had once commanded the stage at the Atherton Conservatory, who had bled for her art. He thought he was buying a clumsy shuffle. He thought he was paying for a spectacle of failure. A slow, cold fury began to burn through Isabella's veins. It was a rage so profound it eclipsed the humiliation. He wanted a show. He wanted to see her dance. Fine. She would give him a show. But it wouldn't be the one he paid for. She wouldn't dance for him. She would dance at him. She would take his dirty money, and she would show him and everyone in this room of pampered, oblivious elites what a soul in motion truly looked like. She took a small step forward, her movements deliberate. The restaurant held its breath. "The song," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, clear as a bell in the silent room. "If I do this, I choose the song." A flicker of surprise crossed Blackwood's face. He had expected tears or a hasty retreat, not a negotiation. He gave a slight, indulgent nod. "Fine. Whatever you want." Isabella turned to Mr. Henderson, who was hovering by the kitchen entrance, his face a pale mask of horror. "Mr. Henderson," She called out, her voice resonating with an authority he had never heard from her. "Please ask the pianist to play Wir letzte Lieder, the final movement." There was a murmur through the crowd. Strauss's 4 last songs. It wasn't a waltz. It wasn't a cheerful melody. It was a sweeping, melancholic, transcendent piece about death and transfiguration. An impossible piece to dance to without deep classical training. Blackwood's eyebrow arched. This was not the choice of a flustered waitress. The older man, Robert, leaned toward Damien. "For God's sake, Damien, the girl is calling your bluff. Let it go." But Damien Blackwood never let anything go. He simply gave Isabella a curt nod, a silent command to proceed. Isabella walked to the small open space in the center of the dining room. The marble floor was cold and unforgiving under her thin, sensible work shoes. She bent down, and with a grace that seemed out of place, she untied the laces. She slipped off the shoes, then her socks, and placed them neatly to the side. The act of baring her feet was intimate a warrior shedding unnecessary armor. She stood her bare soles pressing against the cold stone. She untied the crisp white apron from around her waist, folded it with methodical precision, and laid it over her discarded shoes. She was left in her simple black slacks and a plain white button-down shirt, the uniform of her servitude. But as she stood there, she transformed it. It was no longer a uniform. It was a costume. The pianist, a seasoned professional who had been quietly playing background music all night, looked from Mr. Henderson to Isabella, a question in his eyes. Henderson gave a weak, defeated nod. After a moment's hesitation, the first ethereal, shimmering chords of Strauss's masterpiece filled the restaurant. The music was a sigh, a breath of sorrow and acceptance. For a few bars, Isabella didn't move. She stood with her eyes closed, letting the music wash over her, letting it find the broken pieces of the dancer she once was. She could feel every patron's stare, could feel Blackwood's analytical gaze burning into her. They were all waiting, and then she began to move. It started with her hands, a slow, fluid unfolding of her fingers as if releasing a captive bird. Her arms followed, carving the air with a language of longing. Her spine articulated a wave of motion that was impossibly graceful. This was not the awkward shuffling of an amateur. This was the controlled, sublime movement of a master. The arrogance on Damien Blackwood's face began to dissolve, replaced by a stunned, sharp intake of breath. The men at his table sat bolt upright. Across the room, conversations had died completely. Forks and knives were frozen mid-air. The only sounds were the soaring notes from the piano and the softer, whisper-quiet brush of Isabella's bare feet on the marble. She wasn't just dancing. She was telling a story. Her body became a vessel for the music's profound melancholy. Her movement spoke of a dream that had died, of a flight that had been cut short. She used the space around her, her hands brushing the edge of an empty table, her body arching back as if pleading with the opulent chandeliers above. It was a dance of exquisite grief, of a spirit trapped in a cage yearning for the sky. A turn, a spin so perfectly executed, it was a blur of motion ended in a sudden sharp drop to the floor. She lay there for a beat, a broken doll on the cold marble, her form conveying utter despair. The music swelled a crescendo of orchestral longing, and she rose with it. Not a jump, but a slow, agonizing, unfurling, as if a crushed flower were forcing its way back toward the sun. Her face, which had been a mask of professional neutrality all night, was now alive with emotion. Tears streamed freely down her cheeks, but her expression was not one of weakness. It was one of fierce, defiant beauty. She was channeling every ounce of her pain, her loss, her frustration with her life, into this one impossible performance. She was taking the ugliness of the dare and transforming it into something breathtakingly beautiful. Damien Blackwood was no longer just watching. He was transfixed. The world of numbers of profit and loss had vanished. The analytical mind that could dissect a balance sheet in seconds was struggling to process what it was seeing. He had expected to see a waitress. Instead, he was witnessing art in its purest, most visceral form. He had thrown $10,000 at her as an insult, and she had thrown back a masterpiece. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been utterly annihilated. He was no longer the king in his court. He was just a man in the audience, completely and utterly humbled. The final haunting notes of the Strauss composition hung in the air, vibrating with a sorrow so palpable it felt like a physical presence. Isabella held her final pose, a study in breathtaking contradiction. One arm was stretched towards the ceiling, a desperate reach for salvation, while her body was crumpled towards the floor, an embodiment of earthly despair. Her chest rose and fell with ragged breaths, and the silent tears that had traced paths down her face now dripped onto the cold marble. For a long, suspended moment, the entire restaurant was caught in her orbit, held captive by the raw, incandescent power of her performance. The spell was broken by a single sharp sound. A woman at a nearby table let out an audible sob. It was the crack in the dam. Suddenly the silence erupted. It wasn't polite applause. It was a roar, a spontaneous, thunderous standing ovation that shook the crystal glasses on the tables. Patrons were on their feet, their faces a mixture of shock, awe, and profound emotion. They weren't clapping for a waitress who had performed a party trick. They were honoring an artist who had just ripped her soul open for them to see. Isabella slowly, painfully straightened up. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind an exhausted, trembling ache. The raw emotion of the dance drained away, and the harsh reality of her surroundings flooded back in. The faces, the applause, Mr. Henderson, looking like he was about to faint, it was all a blur. Her eyes, almost against her will, found Damien Blackwood. He was still seated a lone island in a sea of standing admirers. His three companions were on their feet, clapping as loudly as anyone, but Damien remained motionless. His silver eyes were locked on her, his face a granite mask of unreadability. But something was different. The smug certainty was gone. The casual cruelty had vanished. In its place was something raw and unsettling, a look of such intense, focused disbelief that it felt more invasive than his earlier scorn. He looked like a man who had just witnessed a fundamental law of his universe being broken. He had tried to purchase a moment of humiliation and had instead been handed a revelation. Isabella ignored him. She ignored everyone. With a mechanical grace born of exhaustion, she walked back to her small pile of belongings. She picked up her apron, her socks, her sensible, worn-out shoes. She didn't put them back on. She simply held them, the rough fabric of the apron, a grounding, familiar texture in her hands. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to the stunned pianist, and then turned, intending to walk straight to the staff locker room, away from the prying eyes, away from the life she had just so spectacularly exposed. Mademoiselle Rossi. The voice was crisp-accented and carried an unmistakable air of authority. It cut through the applause like a conductor's baton. An elegant silver-haired woman was making her way through the tables towards Isabella. She was dressed in a simple but exquisitely tailored Chanel suit, her bearing regal and commanding. Isabella recognized her instantly, and a jolt of pure cold shock went through her. It was Madame Dubois, the legendary choreographer, the artistic director of the San Francisco National Ballet, the woman who had been a guest lecturer at Atherton, a figure of such terrifying and revered status that students would practically genuflect in her presence. Madame Dubois stopped a few feet from Isabella, her sharp, intelligent eyes scanning her from head to toe. The applause began to die down as people recognized the famous choreographer and turned to witness this anew, unexpected chapter of the drama. "I thought it was you," Madame Dubois said, her voice softer now, but no less intense. "I saw the line of your arm the way you held your neck. No one else has that. I thought I was seeing a ghost, the ghost of Giselle from the 19 Atherton showcase." The 19 showcase. It was the last time Isabella had danced on a real stage. The performance where she had been hailed as the conservatory's next great star, just weeks before the fall that had ended everything. "Madame," Isabella whispered, her throat dry. "What are you doing here, child?" Madame Dubois asked, her gaze sweeping over the apron in Isabella's hands. There was no judgment in her voice, only a deep, profound confusion. "Serving tables. A talent like yours, it does not belong here. It belongs to the world. We all thought you had disappeared, vanished." Isabella couldn't speak. All the carefully constructed walls she had built around her past were crumbling. To be recognized here like this by the one person whose opinion had once mattered more than anyone's, it was more terrifying and more validating than the applause of 100 strangers. From the corner of her eye, she saw Damien Blackwood rise slowly from his seat. He was watching the interaction between Isabella and Madame Dubois, his mind clearly working, putting pieces together. The waitress he had dismissed, the little ballerina he had mocked, was being personally addressed by the city's foremost authority on dance. The asset he had tried to value at $10,000 was suddenly revealing an entirely different, incalculable worth. "It's a long story, madame," Isabella finally managed to say, her voice trembling slightly. "Then it is a story I must hear," Madame Dubois said firmly. She pulled a slim business card from her purse. "You will call me tomorrow morning. This is not a request, Isabella. It is a command. A gift like yours is a responsibility. To waste it is a sin." She pressed the card into Isabella's hand. The crisp embossed paper felt like a verdict. Isabella looked down at the elegant script, "Juliette Dubois, Artistic Director, SFNB." The entire scene had played out in front of the most powerful people in the city. Damien Blackwood's dare had backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable. He had intended to expose her as a fraud, a nobody with airs. Instead, he had revealed her as a lost prodigy. He had lit a match to mock her, and had instead started a forest fire, illuminating a talent he couldn't possibly comprehend. Isabella finally looked back at him. The mask was gone. His face was a canvas of conflicting emotions, shock, fury, and something else. Something that looked unnervingly like possessive fascination. He had lost control of the narrative completely. This was no longer his show. He had pulled the pin on a grenade, and it had detonated in his own hand, leaving him standing amidst the fallout, staring at the woman he had tried to break, who had instead broken his entire perception of the world. He had dared a waitress to dance, and she hadn't just stolen the spotlight, she had become the sun, and his world was now forced to revolve around her. In the deafening silence that followed Madame Dubois' pronouncement, Isabella clutched the small, stiff business card in her hand. It felt heavier than a brick, a tangible symbol of a life she had been forced to abandon. The weight of it was suffocating. She gave a jerky nod to the choreographer, unable to form words, and then she turned and fled. She didn't run, but she moved with a desperate, focused speed, pushing through the swinging doors into the chaotic, clattering world of the kitchen. The sounds of sizzling pans and shouted orders were a welcome cacophony, a shield against the charged atmosphere of the dining room. She didn't stop until she reached the cramped, windowless staff locker room, the air thick with the smell of bleach and stale coffee. She leaned against the cool metal of a locker, her legs threatening to give out. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She had done it. She had danced, and in doing so, she had unleashed the very past she had tried so hard to bury. Mr. Henderson burst into the room moments later, his face blotchy with panic. "Rossi, what in God's name was that? Do you have any idea what you've done? I did what he paid me to do." Isabella said, her voice flat, devoid of the energy that had fueled her performance. "You made a scene. You turned my dining room into a theater. Mr. Blackwood." "Mr. Blackwood will be fine." A low voice cut in from the doorway. Both Isabella and Mr. Henderson turned. Damien Blackwood stood there, filling the narrow entrance. He had followed her. The kitchen staff behind him scurried away, sensing the dangerous shift in the atmosphere. He had shed his dinner companions his professional mask and was now staring at her with that same raw, unsettling intensity from the dining room. "Henderson, leave us." Blackwood commanded, his voice soft but laced with steel. It was not a request. "Mr." Henderson looked from his employee to the billionaire, swallowed hard, and practically evaporated from the room. The door swung shut, leaving Isabella alone with the man who had orchestrated her public unmasking. "That was quite the spectacle," he said, taking a step into the room. The cramped space seemed to shrink around his presence. Isabella said nothing. She just watched him, her hand still clenched around Madame Dubois' card. He gestured vaguely toward the direction of the dining room. "Juliette Dubois. She's a notoriously harsh critic. I've been trying to get her to endorse a new performing arts center my company is funding. She won't even return my calls." He paused, his silver eyes boring into her. "She called you by name." "My name is Isabella," she said, her voice sharp. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, but it held no humor. "Yes, I'm beginning to realize that." He walked closer, stopping a few feet away. He was no longer looking at her like a piece of furniture. He was looking at her like a complex problem he was determined to solve. "The check is still on the table," he said. "You earned it. I don't want your money." She spat the words, tasting like ash. The rage was returning, a slow, hot tide. "Don't be a fool. Of course you do," he said dismissively. "You wouldn't have danced otherwise. The only thing that's changed is the valuation. 10,000 was an insult. I see that now. My apologies. My assessment of the asset was flawed." Asset. The word was a slap in the face. He still saw her through the cold lens of a transaction. He wasn't seeing a person. He was seeing an undervalued stock that had just skyrocketed. "I am not an asset, Mr. Blackwood." "Everything is an asset," he countered smoothly. "Your talent. It's a commodity. A rare one, it seems. And it's being wasted here, washing dishes and serving scallops." He reached into his jacket and pulled out not a checkbook, but a sleek black business card of his own. He slid it onto the small bench between them. "I want to offer you a contract." Isabella stared at him, dumbfounded. "A contract. I will fund your return to dancing," he stated, as if discussing a corporate merger. "The best doctors for your ankle, the best trainers, a private studio. I'll arrange a private audition with Dubois. I'm sure she'll take my call now. I will sponsor. You manage you. In return, Blackwood Capital will get exclusive rights to your career. Endorsements, appearances, performance fees. We will make you a star, and we will both become very wealthy." It was the most audacious, arrogant, and insulting proposal she had ever heard. He thought he could buy her comeback. He thought he could own her art, package it, and sell it for a profit. He thought that because he had discovered her, he was entitled to her. Isabella started to laugh. It wasn't a happy sound. It was a broken, bitter laugh that echoed strangely in the small room. Blackwood frowned, a flicker of irritation crossing his features. "What's so funny?" "You," she said, shaking her head in disbelief. "You still don't get it, do you? You think this is about money. You think you can just write a check and own my soul." "I'm not interested in your soul," he said coldly. "I'm interested in the product it creates. That performance out there, that's a multi-million-dollar product. You're sitting on a gold mine, and you're too proud or too foolish to see it. What you saw out there wasn't a product," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce, low whisper. She took a step towards him, all fear gone, replaced by righteous fury. "It was my pain. It was my grief. It was everything your world of money and power took from me and my family. My father is sick because he worked himself into the ground for men like you building your glass towers while his own body broke. I'm in this uniform because his medical bills cost more than he ever earned in his life. That dance, that was paid for with a currency you couldn't possibly understand." She was so close now he could see the fire in her dark eyes, the defiant set of her jaw. She was magnificent in her rage. "You wanted to humiliate me," she continued, her voice trembling with emotion. "You wanted to see the poor little waitress stumble. You offered me $10,000 to display my brokenness for your amusement. And now you want to buy it, to put a price on it." She looked down at the 2 business cards, Madame Dubois' in her hand, his on the bench. One represented art passion, a return to the life she loved. The other represented commerce ownership, a gilded cage far more binding than the one she was already in. She let his card sit there. She didn't touch it. "Keep your contract, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice ringing with finality. "And keep your blood money. The price of my soul is not for sale." With that, she turned her back on him, opened her locker and began to change out of her uniform, her movements sharp and deliberate. It was the most profound dismissal he had ever experienced. He, Damien Blackwood, a man who could buy and sell countries, had just been unequivocally, absolutely rejected by a waitress in a back room. He stood there for a long moment, watching her, the gears in his formidable brain grinding to a halt. He had encountered a variable he couldn't quantify, a force he couldn't leverage. For the first time in his life, he had made an offer, and it wasn't nearly enough. The week following the incident at Aria was a study in surrealism for Isabella. She quit her job the very next morning, a liberating act that was immediately followed by the terrifying reality of unemployment. She walked out of the restaurant, leaving Damien Blackwood's $10,000 check sitting on the table where he'd left it, a silent, final statement. Her life became a quiet routine of visiting her father Leo at the small state-funded care facility. He sat in a wheelchair by the window, his large carpenter's hands, which had once been so strong and capable now, lying limp and curled in his lap. The disease was progressing, but his eyes were still sharp, still full of the quiet pride that had defined his life. She never told him about the dare, the dance, or the billionaire. She just sat with him, read him the newspaper, and massaged his unresponsive hands, pretending a normalcy that felt a million miles away. The day after the dance, she had called Madame Dubois. Her hand trembled as she dialed the number. The conversation was brief and direct. The choreographer had been impressed, yes, but also concerned. "A performance born of rage is powerful, Isabella," she had said, her French accent adding weight to every word. "But a career is built on discipline. Your ankle, the reason you left Atherton. Is it healed? It's complicated," Isabella had answered honestly. The ankle was physically healed, but the trauma of the fall, The betrayal of her own body was a phantom limb that ached with every memory of the stage. Come to the studio. We will see how complicated Madame Dubois had instructed, giving her a time for the following week. The appointment hung over Isabella's head, both a beacon of hope and a source of profound dread. Meanwhile, Damien Blackwood didn't disappear. He was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, and her rejection had not deterred him. It had galvanized him. He approached the problem of Isabella Rossi with the same relentless strategic precision he applied to a hostile takeover. It began subtly. 2 days after she quit, a courier delivered a thick file to her tiny apartment. Inside were the complete medical records and case files for a doctor. Alistair Finch, the foremost specialist in neurological sports injuries in the country, based out of a private clinic in Palo Alto. A handwritten note on Blackwood capital letterhead was clipped to the top. It read, "He is the best. An initial consultation has been arranged and paid for. Your father's case has also been sent for his review." Isabella threw the file on her kitchen table, her heart pounding, with a mixture of fury and a deeply uncomfortable flicker of hope. He had investigated her. He had delved into the most private, painful parts of her life, her injury, her father's illness, and was now attempting to use them as leverage. It was an invasion, a violation of her privacy. It was also an astonishingly effective, brutally logical move. She ignored the file. 2 days later, a long black town car, the kind that whispers its expense, was parked outside her father's care facility. As she exited the driver, a stoic man in a black suit stepped out and opened the rear door for her. "Ms. Rossi, Mr. Blackwood sent me. He thought you might appreciate a more comfortable ride home." "Tell Mr. Blackwood I prefer the bus," she said, her voice colder than the evening air, and walked past the car without a second glance. The next day, it was flowers. Not just a bouquet, but an entire jungle delivered to her small apartment. Orchids, lilies, and roses in shades of white and cream filled her living room with an overpowering, cloying scent. The card was simple. "I am not known for my subtlety." She dragged them all out into the hallway for her neighbors to take. He was waging a campaign, a series of overtures designed to demonstrate his power, his reach, his ability to solve the very problems that were crushing her. He wasn't wooing her with romance. He was wooing her with logistics. He was trying to prove that her life would be quantifiably better under his management. Cadet. Frustrated by her unresponsiveness, he escalated. He began digging deeper into her past, tasking his formidable team of analysts and researchers who normally vetted billion-dollar acquisitions with a new project, the Atherton File. They uncovered everything: her scholarship, her reviews, her meteoric rise, and the details of the accident. The official report was simple during a dress rehearsal for Don Quixote. Her partner had lost his grip during a complex overhead lift. Isabella Rossi had fallen, resulting in a compound fracture of the left ankle, effectively ending her career. Her partner's name was Sebastian Vance. The name sparked something in Damien's memory. He made a call. An hour later, his assistant Arthur, a perpetually calm and efficient man, walked into his penthouse office overlooking the city. "Sir, you asked about Sebastian Vance." "Tell me," Damien said, not looking up from his tablet. "After the incident with Miss Rossi, he took a year off. Then he was recruited by the Royal Ballet in London. He's now a principal dancer, considered one of the best of his generation. Critics call him electrifying, but unpredictable." Damien finally looked up, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. He had found it. The missing piece of the puzzle, the emotional core of the problem. It wasn't just the fall, the injury. It was the partner, the betrayal. He saw the path forward with perfect clarity. Her rejection of him wasn't just about pride. It was about fear. Fear of the stage, fear of the past, fear of relying on a partner who might let her fall again. He thought he understood. And in his arrogance, he believed he could fix it. He wouldn't just give her a stage, he would exorcise her demons for her. He would show her that he, Damien Blackwood, was a partner who would never let her fall. His next move would not be flowers or car services. It would be a grand, dramatic gesture. He would set the stage for her triumphant return, removing every obstacle, real or imagined. He would orchestrate the entire event, controlling every variable. He would bring her past to the present and force a confrontation, believing that in the ensuing emotional wreckage she would have no choice but to turn to him, the architect of her salvation. It was a brilliant, ruthless, and catastrophically misguided plan, born from the mind of a man who understood the mechanics of power, but knew absolutely nothing about the workings of the human heart. The summons from Madame Dubois arrived a week later. It was not a phone call, but a formal embossed invitation delivered by courier. It requested Isabella's presence at the SFNB's primary rehearsal hall for a private assessment. The formality of it made Isabella's stomach clench. This was real. This was her one terrifying chance to step back into the world she had lost. When she arrived, the building was mostly empty, the weekend quiet, a stark contrast to the weekday bustle she remembered. Madame Dubois met her at the entrance to Studio A, the largest rehearsal space, its wall of mirrors reflecting the vast, empty, sprung wood floor. "Isabella," the choreographer greeted her, her expression unreadable. "Thank you for coming. There is a situation. A potential benefactor has made a very generous offer to the company, a new endowment specifically for nurturing new and returning talent." "A benefactor?" Isabella asked, a knot of suspicion tightening in her gut. "He has a particular interest in your career," Madame Dubois said, her eyes watching Isabella carefully. "He has arranged this showcase. He believes in your potential." As she spoke, the door at the far end of the studio opened. Damien Blackwood walked in. He was dressed not in a suit, but in expensive casual athletic wear that looked out of place on him. He looked like a king trying to blend in with his subjects and failing miserably. "Isabella," he said, his voice smooth. "I'm glad you came." Isabella felt the blood drain from her face. "You," she whispered, her voice thick with betrayal. She looked at Madame Dubois. "You knew he was behind this." His offer, a 7-figure donation, was contingent on this audition. Madame Dubois admitted a hint of apology in her tone. In this world, art must often hold hands with commerce, even when it is unpleasant. "This isn't commerce, it's a cage," Isabella shot back, her eyes flashing with anger as she turned back to Damien. "What is this, Damien? Another one of your games? Another attempt to buy me?" "This is an opportunity," he corrected, his confidence unshakable. He genuinely believed he was doing the right thing. "I told you I would give you everything you needed to return. I'm a man of my word. I have provided the stage." He gestured around the magnificent studio. "I have provided the audience." He nodded at Madame Dubois. "And," he said, his voice dropping as if for a grand reveal, "I have provided the perfect partner, one who can help you finally put the past behind you." He nodded to the side door. It opened again, and a man walked out. He was tall, with a lean, muscular build and an air of languid arrogance. His dark hair was artfully messy, and his face was the kind of handsome that was both celebrated and deeply untrustworthy. Isabella's breath hitched in her throat. Her heart stopped. It felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. It was Sebastian Vance. He froze when he saw her, his easy smile faltering for a fraction of a second. He hadn't been told who he was here to see. "Izzy," he breathed, his voice a ghost from a nightmare. The studio, which had felt vast seconds before, was now claustrophobically small. It was her tormentor, and the man who had orchestrated this horrific reunion, all trapped together under the cold, unforgiving lights. "What is he doing here?" Isabella's voice was a strained whisper, directed at Damien, but loud enough for the entire room to hear. "I brought him here," Damien said, a note of triumph in his voice. He was a fool, playing God, utterly blind to the carnage he was creating. "He's the ghost you need to face, the source of your fear. You need to dance with him again, to prove to yourself that the fall was a fluke, that you can trust a partner, trust the stage. You need to conquer this to move forward. Conquer this." He had taken her deepest trauma, her most profound betrayal, and served it up to her on a silver platter as a challenge to be overcome. The arrogance of it was breathtaking. Sebastian had recovered his composure. He sauntered forward, his dancer's grace, making the movement look effortless. "Izzy, my God, it's been years. I heard you dropped off the face of the earth. Serving drinks, was it?" The casual cruelty was still there, sharper than ever. "Get away from me, Sebastian," she said, taking a step back. The mirrored wall prevented any real retreat. "Don't be like that," he said with a charming, predatory smile. "Damien here flew me in all the way from London. Said it was for a prodigy. I had no idea he meant you. It's fate, isn't it?" Her body was screaming. The phantom ache in her ankle flared into a sharp, stabbing pain. She could feel the memory of the fall, the sickening weightlessness, the crack of bone, the searing agony. But most of all, she remembered the look in his eyes just before the lift. A flicker of something cold. Jealousy. He had been the one pushed out of the spotlight by her rising star. The fall had been ruled an accident. But in her heart, she had always harbored a sliver of terrifying doubt. "This is not an opportunity, Damien," she said, her voice shaking with a rage so profound it felt like it might tear her apart. "This is a violation. You dug into my life, you unearthed my worst memory, and you flew him across the world to ambush me with it." She turned to him, her eyes blazing. "You think this is how you help, by forcing me to face the man who destroyed my life? You don't want to help me. You want to own me. You want to be the one who fixed the broken dancer." Damien's confident expression finally began to crumble. He was seeing the flaw in his perfect logical plan. He had treated her trauma like a business problem to be solved with overwhelming force, and it was backfiring spectacularly. "That's not," he started, but she cut him off. "I will never dance with him," she declared, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. She looked at Sebastian, at his smug face, and the doubt she had held for years solidified into a terrible concrete truth. It might not have been deliberate, but it hadn't been entirely accidental either. It was recklessness born of envy. He hadn't secured his grip. He had let her fall. "You're making a mistake. Isabella," Damien said, his voice tight with frustration. "No," she said, a strange calm settling over her as she made her decision. "My mistake was ever thinking for 1 second that you or anyone in your world could understand." She looked from Damien's shocked face to Sebastian's mocking one, then to Madame Dubois, whose expression was now one of deep regret. "This audition is over," Isabella announced. She turned and walked towards the door, her back straight, her head held high. Every step was an agony of memory and pain, but she did not falter. She did not look back. She left the three of them standing on the cruel stage Damien had built for her, a silent testament to his profound, catastrophic failure to understand the one asset he desired most. He had wanted to be her savior and had instead cemented his role as her tormentor. Isabella didn't go home. Damien's cruel stage had burned away her fear, leaving only pure resolve. She now understood that if she was going to rise, it had to be on her own. The next morning, she called Madame Dubois. "I'm calling to ask for 1 hour of your time," she said, "and the use of Studio A. I'm going to give you my real audition." 2 days later, she stood alone on the studio floor before the choreographer. There was no music. In complete silence, Isabella began to dance. Her performance was not a story of grief, but of reconstruction. It began with the small, broken movements of her fall, reliving the moment that had shattered her. Then slowly she began to put the pieces back together, her movements gaining strength and fluidity. The dance was a testimony to her grueling recovery, a battle against fear made visible. Its climax was a series of defiant leaps, landed not with ethereal grace, but with solid, grounded strength. She was not a fairy or a swan. She was a woman reclaiming her power. When she finished, Madame Dubois was on her feet, her face filled with reverence. "In 50 years," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I have never seen a dancer with more courage. The principal role of Giselle is yours if you want it." Tears of release streamed down Isabella's face. "I want it," she whispered. That evening, Damien Blackwood was waiting for her, his usual arrogance replaced by a weary humility. "I came to apologize," he said. "What I did was monstrous. I treated you like a business venture, and I was wrong." He explained he had set up an anonymous trust to cover her father's medical care indefinitely. "It's not a contract," he insisted. "It's restitution." Isabella saw him then not as a billionaire, but as a lonely man who only understood transactions. The gesture was one of genuine compassion. "The season premiere for Giselle is in 6 months," she told him as he turned to leave. "Perhaps you'd like to buy a ticket." A real smile, warm and human, spread across his face. "I'd like that very much, Isabella," he said. Their story wasn't a fairy tale, but a violent collision that had reshaped them both. Standing on the precipice of a new life she had built from the ashes that was more than enough. And so a story that began with a cruel dare ended with a quiet promise. Isabella Rossi didn't need a billionaire to save her. She only needed him to light the fuse that would allow her to save herself. Damien Blackwood learned a lesson that money could never buy, that the true value of a person can't be listed on a stock exchange. Their journey reminds us that our deepest scars can be the source of our greatest strength, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is dance in the face of those who try to bring you down. If this story of defiance, resilience, and the redemptive power of art moved you, please let us know. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own inner strength, and be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next real-life story. Thank you for listening.